morning, everybody, and welcome to our monthly CPD session. We're really delighted that you've joined us for this opportunity to reflect on leadership. Many of you will have watched the previous interview that we did with Phil Denton and Mickey Mellon, where we thought about reflections on leadership, and we also thought about lessons learnt from leadership. We are really delighted this morning to be joined by Andy Best, who is a head teacher in down in the south. About himself in a moment. As we often talk about, this is time and space for your own professional development, opportunities to think about routes into leadership this morning, to try and sort of demystify the process of being a leader in school. And really what we're very grateful to Andy for is an opportunity to hear from a really experienced and really successful leader in his field, and the insights and the wisdom that I know he will share with us. As I say, we're really grateful to Andy. He's given up an hour of his Easter break today to record that, so thanks Andy for doing that. And he's agreed to engage, as I say, in a discussion and a reflection on various different aspects of leadership, which we will sort of explore as we're talking this morning. So morning Andy, how are you?
Good morning. Yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me onto this. Yeah, not too bad. It's these holidays, isn't it? Second week. So I've had that week of like charging down, and now I've got the second week of recharging. So yes, all good, thank you. All good.
Good. So for those of our listeners that don't know you, Andy, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your current role, about your school, and perhaps about your career to date?
Yes. Okay. So I'm currently head teacher of one form-entry primary school down in the deepest depths of East Sussex, near the coast, near Brighton. So that's 210 children, and I have been there as head for 6 years. And although I am starting a new role at a new school in September, so that will be my second headship. But I also had a year as acting head in the school I started at from NQT, which was an interesting journey. And then a couple of years as a head of school, which was a really good sort of learning process within the whole sort of leadership journey I've taken. So I can talk a little bit about that from like acting.
That would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think that was an interesting one, and I think people can learn a lot, or I certainly learned a lot from the way that really happened, and kind of opportunities came to me maybe at times before I looked for them. But so that thus I had to really learn on the job. And there is nothing actually more rich than learning kind of in the moment. So yeah, I was NQT. It was a 2 form-entry primary school, again in East Sussex, and so I was very much an infant teacher, and the first leadership opportunity I had was of leading the Key Stage 1 team. So I did that, I think, probably my sort of 5th year of teaching. So I led the Key Stage 1 team for 3 years, and then when we had a change of headship, I was promoted up to the deputy head teacher role, but it was a shared deputy head role. So there was 2 deputy heads. The other deputy head was basically from Key Stage 2, and I was from Key Stage 1. So we kind of took our team roles to come to the next stage. And so yeah, deputy. I did I think a middle leaders course around that time being deputy, but no other leadership training bar that. And then all of a sudden the head teacher was leaving. The other deputy head went for a headship in a school elsewhere, and I was given the opportunity to be acting head at the school, really because there was no time when the current head teacher left for there to be the whole interview process at that stage for September. So it was really the obvious thing was for me to man the helm and see how that went. So yeah, no MPQH, no MPQSL or anything like that. And it became apparent probably within the first week of being head teacher there that maybe not everything had been made clear to me by the current head teacher, just where we were as a school. And I think that's the first thing I would say to any deputy head teacher who is wanting to step up, or who is, you know, not even wanting to step up, but in terms of your relationship with that working relationship with your head teacher, because you never know what could happen next. You know, the head teacher might go off sick for a month or whatever. You really need to ensure that that communication between yourself and the head is really strong, and you have a really good understanding of your school as well. And I make sure that's what so the first thing I learned, and having obviously a deputy head now who's not out of she's only out of class a day and a half, so we work together, you know, we have our time for a day and a half a week. But I ensure anytime we have a school improvement visit, every time, basically she's involved in everything. So we are very much a leadership team, because if yeah, I stepped into this role as acting head in September, kind of under the impression, under the understanding from conversations with the head teacher, etc., that we were a good school, etc. And the first thing I found out was the local authority were grading us as requires improvement, which was a surprise, and it shouldn't have been a surprise. So that year, there was lots of things that kind of were presented to me that I was having to deal with that were, you know, quite major compared to what I'd experienced as a deputy in the same school. But thankfully, I had I think I had a very supportive team and staff around me. And although we'd been graded that in September, we had an Ofsted in the March, which we weren't necessarily expecting at that stage. That came as a bit of a surprise. And we got a good, and there were some sort of very positive things written in the report that were pleasing. And then the following week, there was the recruitment for the head teacher role. So that was one heck of a march, people. Ofsted, 2-day Ofsted that I'd never had any experience with Ofsted. And then the head teacher requirement the following week. So yeah, I will never forget that month. So the recruitment process was a 2-day interview, of which some bits I think shone in, but overall it wasn't felt I was ready for the role. Now there's two ways you can take that, isn't there? You've been the acting head, you've steered the school from requires improvement to good in a short space of time. You could take that as a real knock and throw your toys out of the pram, or you could accept it and go, do you know what? I've actually been at this school for 11 years. This is now my opportunity. I've shown what I can do. This is now my opportunity to take on, to go somewhere else, learn in a different environment, and build on this. And it was the latter I chose. The local authority seconded me to a school as head of school, working in a soft federation with 2 other primary schools in the local area. And that was a fantastic role to have, to learn. So in this, obviously, I'm very much within the state school environment. So I know within your academy trust there will be similar roles, but I wouldn't know exactly what they'd be called. But head of school, I've obviously got an executive head, of which, for want of a better word, the buck stops with them. But you do have an autonomy to sort of make, to make your own decisions and to kind of go with things as well, because obviously they're not there all the time. And I was very lucky. My executive head, who I'm still, have a very good relationship with, because I learned so much from her. was very trusting of me, had real faith in me to kind of run with things, and she wasn't needing to be there all the time, and holding my hand. And although I was only there for, I don't think I was even there for 2 years because it was a secondment, I think maybe a year and a half. Again, I learned a lot, and obviously I was suddenly working with a whole new staff. I was working. I came into school that was being run in a slightly different way to what I'd experienced, so I had to kind of find a balance of that. But again, it was a successful year and a half. But the way the school was moving forward, I didn't feel that the leadership structure was going to be right for me to take that headship on permanently. So I seized an opportunity to go elsewhere, and a school came up, of which I've now been there. Well, it'll be 6 years exactly next week, because I started in the April of 2017. So Rocks Park Primary School in Uckfield, East Sussex, was my first, I would call, proper headship. And that was an interesting start. I knew going there that there was going to need to be a little bit of work to do. I could tell that when I'd gone round and done my tour and everything before applying. But the first thing I walked in on was a restructure. So that, which was ultimately 4 support staff, 4 teaching assistants, were going to have to go. Now, because of where I started in the year in April, that process had actually already been started. I didn't have to introduce it, but obviously it was a very difficult atmosphere to walk in on for those first 2 terms. And 3 had taken voluntary redundancy, but I still had to do a very difficult process of interviewing 3 people for the one last spot. So yeah, that was a real learning curve. But ultimately, it's what the school needed, and there was some streamlining of staff that needed to take place for that school to move forward. So it put us in a stronger position from September to start making the changes with the teaching and learning that needed to take place. And 12 months in, I had Ofsted there and got a good. I actually had 3 Ofsteds in 4 years in 3 different schools, which was a really, really good learning experience for that. And yeah, so I got a good there, and it's been there ever since. Obviously, I felt we were really gaining momentum. For those who are kind of on the verge of moving into their first headship, or thinking, right, that is my next step. The first thing I'd say, when you start as a head teacher, is it takes time for you to really feel that what you're doing is having an impact. And when I say time, I'm talking 1 year, 2 years. And don't worry about that. That's how it should be, because you want these things to be sustained over time. And I really felt we were gaining so much momentum, and then COVID kicked in. So I probably had the team exactly how I wanted it to be, and a really, real good buzz going on around the school. And then we had all the challenges of COVID. But yeah, this is where we're at now. But 6 years in my first headship, I felt this year it's the time for me to start thinking about moving on elsewhere, because of I feel I don't know now where to take the school next, from where I took it to where it is now. And I think someone else needs to come in and try that. So that's the wanting to change reason, really. I think 6 years is a good time.
Fabulous, thank you. So as I've explained to you sort of in our pre-interview, all of our schools in our trust are secondary schools. And our colleagues will have contact with primary schools. We will all have people who are linked in with transition work at various different key stages. But I think what would be really interesting for colleagues to hear, if you'd be happy to share, is what are you finding are the challenges in primary at the moment? You've reflected on the fact that post-COVID, or sort of pre-COVID, you were in a really good space, and then there are challenges post-COVID. What's the primary landscape feel like at the moment, and what are the things that as secondary colleagues you think we should be aware of from that primary context?
Well, I mean, it's the first thing I'd say, and obviously I don't want to be, I don't want to come across as being negative, but it's tough. It's tough, and I'm sure in your secondary schools you are finding it's tough at the minute. And I think I heard someone say the other day that, and I thought they kind of nailed it with this, was that we are trying to get back into a normal. This year really feels like we've been trying to get back, or kind of the expectations are to be back into like a normal routine, but we're not within the same normal environment we were in pre-COVID. I think things have come out of COVID that we're battling. And from a primary perspective, and this is, from what we're having to manage in my school, but also conversations with other heads, I think send provision is a very challenging aspect at the minute. I mean, obviously, I'm talking from a state situation here where financially there's very limited resources, but send support actually coming from a local authority for individual children is quite hard. But also the pressures of parents and expectations of parents. There does, in my opinion, there is a pandemic now of parents who believe that their children are there's many diagnoses they're giving their children, and not necessarily waiting or respecting our professional opinions. Coming back, that's possibly quite a controversial thing for me to be saying at this stage, but that is something we are battling with at the minute. And I think in terms of the relevance that for transition's sake is, I think that these children are then moving to secondary school, and probably a heck of a lot of expectations from parents about what support we put in place for them in what is a very different environment from primary to secondary. So that's the first thing I would say. Is a real challenge. I still think we're still finding our feet in terms of where around assessment and the secretarial side of things, in writing, etc. I don't think the children although sort of SATs results weren't in Key Stage 2 weren't nationally very alarming last year compared to the Key Stage 1 ones, which were significantly lower, and I think will be again this year. There's still some real inconsistencies around your basic punctuations and handwriting, etc. And I don't know if that's being noticed as they move up to secondary school at the minute. But certainly what we've and then I think the third thing is, in reflection, and this is the most key, in reflection of the Ofsted framework, which is obviously very curriculum based now, that transition from primary to secondary across all the subjects. So in the past, I think there would obviously be a lot of focus on where the children were at in English and maths. But what we've been trying to do with our local secondary school is set up transition meetings with the subject leads for Key Stage 3 and the primary schools in the local area, for history, for geography, for as well as maths, etc., art, so that there's a real understanding of what the primary curriculum is, what's delivered there, in those subjects, which maybe in the past, I mean, you know, and I, pardon me if I'm not right here, but it's always felt that they weren't really ever discussed between primary and secondary.
Mm.
But now there's a balanced focus on all of those subjects and what's been taught in Key Stage 2 before they go to Key Stage 3, so that things aren't being repeated, or there's not a massive gap in expectations from what they've been doing. And we ran those last year. We've run them this year as well, but it was quite clear in your arts and your histories, etc. There was quite a difference in what the understanding of what was being done in primary
Mm-hmm.
compared to secondary.
Mm.
So I think the framework has created more discussions in that area.
Mm. And some of our schools will have multiple feeder schools that lead into them. And as you
Yes.
say, that's really, really challenging then, where primary schools may have modified those year 5 and 6 curriculum, may have tackled it in a different way. But to gain a really good understanding of the context of the children coming into school and as much about that curriculum experience that they've had, as you say, is absolutely fundamental. It's really interesting, your reflections though about the sort of perhaps what we might call the basics, the spelling, the punctuation and grammar and so on. Are you seeing differences amongst the cohort? So what I mean by that is, are you seeing sort of waves of challenges? So when you look at your early years and your reception children in comparison to, say, your year 6 children now, are you seeing different sorts of challenges that are coming off the back of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, in primary schools, I think that where you can really see the year groups or the cohorts that miss the most in terms of, you know, that school experience is probably around our year 2 and year 3. And I think that's going to be reflected in last year's and this year's Key Stage 1 national results, which actually last year were in the 50s compared to the usual, you know, mid to late 70s. But you know, it's because they miss so much of that early development, that speech and language, in reception year 1, the phonics, the simple full stop and capital letter understandings they pick up in end of reception, beginning year 1. There was so much of that missed that the year 2, year 3 teachers are finding they're still playing a lot of catch up. And there's and I think across all the year groups though, where you would really be able to see your kind of your higher ability, your middle ability, your lower ability, however you want to phrase it. But you kind of had, you know, you had that group of children there, you had that group of children there, and you had that group of children there. Now there's just, if you did it across a windscreen, in every cohort, there seems to be far more of a range. And I think so for teachers, planning and meeting every individual's needs is harder. It's harder because they all experienced kind of all of their experiences during lockdown, and that kind of home learning time was all very different. So I think teachers are probably feeling the pressure more in terms of children making progress, and how they do that when it does feel like some children are taking that much longer to kick forward. So yeah, across the school, I would say year 2, year 3 are our real areas where it's the most noticeable. But then in all year groups, kind of year 4, 5, 6, there's still those challenges that we're picking up on.
And so I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume therefore that your year 4, 5, 6 teachers for a considerable period of time now are going to have to amend their curriculum to reflect the challenges that, so your current year 2s and 3s are going to perhaps need something slightly different in 4, 5 and 6. Yep. So that transition period that our colleagues are going to be continuing to do in secondary is going to look and feel different, would you sense? So what the transition this year for 5s and 6s will look different to 1 in 2 years' time. Would that be a fair conclusion?
I think certainly sort of this year's year 6s and to a certain extent next year's year 6s, current year 5s, they're probably still going to be apparent when they come up to year 7 that there are still gaps in their learning that maybe weren't there in 2019, 2020, etc. I think there still needs to be some patience around that, or not alarm bells. But I'd like to think that each year, we will see a change. And so I even look at our year 3s now, and I see how creative and actually, that they're a really great cohort of children. And there's nothing to say, well, they won't come year 6, they should be at that expected stage, because it's just a time thing. But I think probably there's less frustration ironically, in year 3 and year 2 than maybe there is with the year 4, 5 teachers, because they know there's that pressure of Key Stage 2 sats coming up and everything that brings. So I think there are still those I don't know, like a tail from COVID, but I'd like to think that each year that will change, that will improve year by year, and it won't become each year those improvements will be seen.
And that's really helpful, because I think as we've been talking about transition, it's really making me reflect on the fact that we've got to, as secondary colleagues, be really alive to those differences and not make assumptions about the children that we might see next year in year 7. There are going to be different challenges for future cohorts, but you're seeming really optimistic actually that those will begin to even out the longer you've got with those children in primary.
I mean, what our constant challenge and our battle is at the minute is these children, where the children who are still needed to fill in those gaps and take those sort of strides forward to catch up, if you like, and obviously there's been all the catch up grants and whatnot. My issue is, my concern is, the more you take them out of class to do these boosters and etc., you're then taking them out, and then you're having to plug another gap from what they've just missed. So we're trying at Rocks to just do it within the classroom as much as we possibly can. I mean, our year 6 do a little bit of stuff, like before school kind of booster sessions, etc. But on the whole, it's to try and keep them in class as much as possible, because otherwise you'll constantly, like, there's more and more gaps being created if you're not careful with the learning time they're missing. What we do try and do in terms of like the secondary schools is our moderation meetings and everything that we organise across our town, is when we do our next round of meetings, the year 7 teachers will come to those, so they can have those conversations and see where they're at, see a good range of children across the town before we break up in July. And this year as well, the transition days are, I think they're going to be 2 days as opposed to 1 day, so the children will spend a little bit more time up at the secondary school in July than they were previously. And then with 10 children, there's more of a program as well. So yeah, but behind all of that academic is this whole social emotional aspect that is also now sort of building. And so I think there's more of an awareness, or more of a profile, obviously, of children's anxieties, etc. And I think more and more parents are then anxious for their children moving up into secondary school, and maybe they're carrying that anxiety through their child. And so the secondary school, probably there's more focus for them on managing that, and having, things in place for that.
Absolutely. And
So,
something for our colleagues to really think about. We will be approaching the season as you are of transition days and arrangements for that, but also, as we know, that induction and transition carries on into September, and it's not a one-day process, but really being aware of the challenges that you're reflecting on for your children and parents will not be dissimilar to what we're seeing, albeit in a different bit of the country, but won't be dissimilar to what we're seeing, and knowing that reflection is there, as you said sort of at the start of this point. It's challenging at the moment. It's challenging with behaviour. It's challenging with parental engagement. It's challenging with attendance, and an understanding that is manifesting at primary also is really helpful. And I know you chair a local group of primary heads, don't you? And I would imagine they are sharing similar reflections.
Yeah. So I mean, attendance and behaviour. Yeah. I mean, we've at Rocks, we've been quite. Our attendance has been very positive on the whole, but where we do have, specific individuals with attendance issues, it's very, very difficult, much harder than maybe I found in previous years, to find the ways of addressing those, and finding the answers. And other schools, maybe the larger schools, or maybe slightly different areas of the town, they've got huge, much bigger numbers than they were ever used to, in terms of attendances and behaviour, and what support there is out there for behaviour, and I think that is, and recruitment then on top of that, for I'm not talking about teacher roles, I'm talking about your kind of individual needs assistants and teaching assistants, because that's bread and butter that we need, and you can't recruit. So that then puts pressure on other so there's all that side of things as well. I think, if I'm honest, it's certainly the most challenging time I have found as a head. I mean, I'm not asking us to go back to COVID, but you thought during COVID that was the real challenging time. Actually, this is far more challenging.
So as a leader, Andy, in these times that are really challenging, which I think all of the people listening to this will be nodding away as you're saying that, how do you maintain your own well-being and your own kind of balance in that? Because it is really tough, whether you're holding a headship role at the moment, or an assistant head, or a deputy, or middle leadership. How do you, what's your sort of advice and guidance for colleagues around well-being and maintaining that balance?
That's a good question, and a tough one to answer, because even all the things I would preach, I don't necessarily always practice. But I think the key has to be, you've got to be very disciplined with yourself, of turning the laptop off, of coming away from the work at certain times, particularly weekends. I would urge anyone to do as little over a weekend as is possible. I know it's impossible to not do any work, and sometimes actually people will say to me, well, just come away from it, or don't do. And but also that can sometimes cause more stress in your head, because you need to get it done. So I appreciate that doesn't always work, but I think the key is, whether it's weekends or evenings or whenever, you have to find that time where you come away from it. And I mean, for me, it's being active. So, I mean, unfortunately, I can't run anymore because I busted my knee during lockdown, where it was my only way of getting out of the house, wasn't it? So I took it a bit too far, and busted my knee up. And so I haven't been able to run since then, but walking. So I go for a walk every day. Either before school or in the evenings, because that clears the head as well. And actually, sometimes I can do a walk, and I can be thinking about work, but I'm being active, and it feels a more constructive way of doing it, maybe. And then hobbies, get yourself something where one evening a week you're doing something, whether that is a gym class, whether that is a art class you go to, or in my case, snooker. You've got to take yourself away from it sometimes, because
Mm,
it is relentless, isn't it?
mm,
It is
mm,
relentless, and you can't wait every 6 weeks for your holiday to take that break, because you do yourselves in, people. So yeah, I think that's my biggest thing.
mm,
Um, and I found, and then on a work front, I found that sometimes you have to be with the staff. Like, I can't have this conversation at the minute. Be really quite honest. But can you just give me? Can we have this conversation tomorrow?
mhm.
There are times when you know when you pick up, you have to have that conversation. And apologies for the dog, by the way.
It's quite all right.
Um, uh, and but you need to be in the right headspace and be able to sort of take things on as well.
Mm,
Not always just the other person. So do kind of ensure that you're looking after yourself in
mm,
that respect, in terms of making sure it's not a revolving door
mm,
all day with staff wanting to talk to you and unload onto you. You need to also say, okay, and then do we have to have this conversation right now?
mm,
Because actually, I think I'll be in a better place to have this conversation at
mm,
8 o'clock tomorrow, or 10 o'clock
mm,
tomorrow morning, as opposed to 4:30 now.
mm.
Things like that.
So I think what you're advocating is a real um, honesty in your leadership, but also a real knowledge of yourself and knowing what works, and
Yeah.
knowing that actually at that point that conversation isn't going to happen
Mm.
and can't happen
Yeah.
because of whatever challenges might be going on, but that at another point it will happen, and being able to be honest with your colleagues about that, but also honest with yourself that
Yeah.
you've got your own limits, and there are
Yeah.
times when you're not going to be able to do the things or to do them well.
Yeah. Completely. And I think this leads into what I think you wanted me to talk about, like things I've learned
Yeah, absolutely.
in
That was
my first
segued
headship.
really well there, Andy. Yes. So
Yeah.
tell us about your kind
Seamless,
of,
isn't it?
yeah,
Seamless.
seamless. Tell us about your reflections coming out of your first headship into what will be your second headship, and congratulations on that. Tell us about your reflections. What are the things that you've learned as a leader, sort of advice for colleagues that are listening to
Yeah.
this?
Okay. So I think the biggest thing I've learned, and I always knew, and I was told going into, I would have, I got this more than once before I took on head teacher roles, was, you're too nice to be ahead. You're too nice to be ahead. And I thought at the time, you what? How does that work? And kind of refuted it in my head. But I think at times what I've learned from, I think it's very important, I believe, to be a positive role model, leader, collaborative, to listen to people, to take on how people are feeling, etc. Um, and be very honest about things as well. But where I at times need to find a balance is, I think people can use the phrase people pleaser as a weakness, or almost as a kind of a bit airy, oh, they're just a people pleaser, bit airy fairy. And I think there's a balance of not being a people pleaser as a head, but you constantly want that team to be, everyone to be on good form all the time, and to be at their very, very best, and to be coming in every day kind of full of energy. And as soon as one person's not doing that, you kind of, I'm aware, I've got to sort this out. I've got to,
Mhm.
what's going on? Is anyone else feeling like this? And I think sometimes I exhaust myself with trying to kind of have this seemingly really vibrant, positive, like energetic team right through the school at all times. Now, let's be realistic. That's not going to happen because for all sorts of reasons, but not necessarily because the school's in a complete mess and because you're not doing your job right.
Mm-hmm.
There can be all sorts of circumstances. I think the key is on the whole, are people doing as they should be, and are we on a day-to-day basis running as a good school? Then yes, but the year one teacher might be having an issue at home that they're having to bring in, they're having to manage within the school, and they might not be skipping through into the staff room every day, and that's okay because we'll support them, we'll keep supporting them in that, but it's you can't have it exactly how you want it all the time. And that's probably the thing I would learn from the most. And I think I need to reinvent myself slightly at my next school in terms of managing people and not exhausting myself in trying to make sure everyone is absolutely singing and dancing all the time.
So in that
Yeah.
kind of field, we will have colleagues who are looking to apply for new roles in leadership, or we might have colleagues listening to this who've just secured a new role either for the summer term or for September and are thinking about that transition of themselves as leaders. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit. As I said, I know you've just secured a second headship. How did you go around preparing for that application and interview process? Are there some tips and advice you could share for colleagues who are maybe thinking about looking for new roles at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the obvious is to go and look at the schools and only go for those schools that feel right as you walk around. But I think that's probably a fairly obvious thing to say. But when it comes to applying and putting that application in, the key is going through that person spec that you will get in the application. So the specifications, not the job description part, the person spec, and what you need to think about for each single one is talking about an experience of that and the impact it's had. And the impact is key because that is what have you done. So you can talk about all the things that you've created. We set this project up, and I work with 5 other teachers across the trust looking at this aspect in maths. But what impact did it have? So a friend of mine, hang on, I get it from my notes. She showed me this really good way of mapping it out, so that when you're putting that letter together, you're going for each person spec, you're thinking of, right, I've got an example for that. This is the evidence I have of it. And this is how I demonstrated it, and this is the impact I had. So example, evidence, demonstration, impact. And if you look at those 4 things and kind of map it out for each one, because also you'll find that once you've done that application letter and you've shown all that impact, when you have your interview, a lot of those questions, I think, will be based around that person spec. So you're automatically preparing yourself for the interview by having all of that in your head. And yeah, that worked wonders for me, actually, because I know that when I did the interview, it was very quick in my head on those questions. Oh, this is the impact, and I was immediately able to talk about those as examples. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. Don't just talk about what you've done, talk about the impact it's had, because that's the key.
And so when you're thinking about going in and establishing yourself in this new role that you'll take on from September, and as you say, you've got a lot of experience as a head, both as head of school and then at ROCS now, But obviously you're going to a new place where people don't know you, you've got new relationships to build, new teams to establish, etc. I wonder if you could tell us, is there something from your kind of leadership role now that you think I am definitely going to do that again as a way of establishing myself in this new role? And the kind of second part of that is there something that you will do really differently this time, or something that you think actually on reflection now, that's the way that I want to sort of establish myself in this new role? Because I think for our colleagues listening, whilst they might not be taking up headship roles, there will be lots of people who are thinking about how to establish themselves in that new role. So what would you do the same, and what might you do differently this time?
I'll start with it differently, which I think I alluded to earlier in terms of like probably a bit more patience. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the school I'm moving to, is in a good place. There's no massive changes. It's not like I'm going into a school in special measures, etc. So I've got time on my side, and I think the first thing I'll do, I won't think, oh, I've immediately got to do this and do this and do this to show the impact I'm already having here at Pashley. And so I think the first 2 terms year, obviously there'll be a couple of things I do, but I won't. I'll do a lot of watching and observing and taking more time to kind of see how everything works as it is now, before I start coming in and kind of ripping everything up that doesn't necessarily need to be ripped up, might need to be tinkered with at best. So that's the thing I would do differently. I think when I went into Rocks, because it was my first headship, I felt I had to sort of introduce this and do this and do that, and actually that's not the way, because you can't manage all those things. Not all those things will have impact if you try and throw them all in at the same time. And a lot of the things don't actually then have that sustained improvement. What would I do the same? I think it's very important, and I think this is just as important if you're deputy head as you are head teacher, is to get round. I'll be making sure in that first week, or even before we come back in September, is have little 10-15 minute meetings with every member of staff. I don't mean just the teachers, I mean all the members of staff, caretaker, cleaner, cook, because getting to know those people as individuals and how they work and how they tick, and them feeling like that it's essential that they feel, every member of staff feels valued. So I think it's just making sure I find the time and get to know those people immediately. And when it comes to the children, who are obviously equally important, and parents, the children, I make sure I get to know, and I know in secondary school, because of the numbers you have, this would be quite different. But I guess if you take it if you're head of years, or you're going to be head of sixth form or whatever, I will get to know every children's name. So 270 names I'll have to learn, but within the first month. So I'm talking to those children at a one-to-one level, like, straight away. So I think it's about it's building relationships, essentially, is what I'm saying.
And with those conversations that you have with the staff, because as you say, that could be as a head with every member of staff, or it could be an assistant head with a group, a new team that you're going to lead. Do you have any advice for sort of how to structure those, or are they very much just a sit down and a cup of coffee and a chat, or do you have sort of questions that you want to use to guide those conversations?
I wouldn't say I have a set amount. I've set questions asked, but I guess what I'm wanting to find out really is how they work. What stresses them out. What do they find the sort of challenging aspects of the role? What are their future? How do they see themselves in 3-4 years time? So I'm picking out those who've got the real energy, enthusiasm for kind of leadership down the line, because they're the ones I'm going to sort of target for bringing forward for leading projects and etc., where you're naturally going to have those people who aren't so interested in that. And also to a degree, you know, I don't need to I don't need to know all the ins and outs of their home life, but you know, family, like what are they going home to? Because if those who've got young children are going to have their own things that they're managing every evening at home, and they might, you know, need to be going home at a certain time compared to others, etc. I think, you know, it's just building a picture really of them as people, rather than it being kind of an interview with set questions to ask.
And so I suppose as I'm thinking about drawing this interview to a close, what would be your advice for those people who are currently in leadership roles in our trust, or who are aspiring to leadership roles? As a really experienced leader in the sector, what's your perhaps one or two nuggets of advice that you would give them? No pressure, Andy.
No pressure. Okay, the two nuggets of advice from my own experience is don't take the knocks you will get, and we will all get those knocks. You know, if it's whether it's like not getting a job you've gone for, or even on a day-to-day basis, things that you've tried haven't worked out in the way you want them to. Learn from them, as opposed to don't get your head down about them. So I think because everything that, you know, as we say to the children, you know, you learn from your mistakes. So everything that doesn't necessarily go right for you, there'll always be something from it take that will make you better. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second is don't exhaust yourself trying for everyone else to be the best you want them to be all the time, because sometimes it's not always going to go like that.
Those are really, really, really fabulous nuggets of advice, Andy. And I think certainly listening to you this morning, I know that I have appreciated, and I know colleagues will, your really honest reflections about your leadership journey and the challenges that you've had in a really interesting career. I know colleagues will have gained from the insight into primary education as well, but also those real honest reflections about how to lead, how to look after yourself, and how to build those relationships. And we are incredibly grateful to you for giving up an hour of your time in the middle of your Easter holidays when you could be out walking or doing something lovely.
Well,
so we're really, really
I've
grateful
already done that.
to you.
I've already done that, to say, in the rain. But yeah, no. Well, I just hope even if there's just one little thing that someone takes from that. One's enough. That'll do for me.
I'm absolutely sure they will be. Thank you so much, Andy. We've really enjoyed talking this morning.
All right, yeah, no problem. All right.
Take care.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.